forum. I just wanted to take 2 minutes to thank you, Shasha, for moderating such a great session. It's been wonderful discussion, wonderful conversation here. Thank you, Maria, Sate, Michelle, Stefan. Great work, great discussion here. On the world, from our side, from World Economic Forum side, ever since the pandemic started, we have been trying to bring people together, both public and private sector, to respond to this. We have been working on few initiatives. Seth and Stefan and Michelle are part of some of those initiatives. We know that outbreaks will happen. The way the population is increasing, the way we live now, we're getting closer to the woods. Germs, pathogens, they are getting closer to us through animals and other sources. So outbreaks will happen. How do we stop them from becoming full-blown pandemics? That's the question. And that's where we are working on to see if we can monitor these pathogens, catch them early on, come up with medical countermeasures, diagnostics, vaccines, treatments. Sooner you do that, better off you are. So that's one thing. I think the world has the scientific and technical know-how. You see that here. And if we don't have it, we can develop it very quickly. We have the financial resources. The idea is to bring this all together. This needs an international collaboration. This needs partnership. This needs both public and private partnership. We need the political will to bring all these things together. So that's something that we want to work on. We want to bring these people together to do this. Development banks, WHO, Gavi, private sector, they all have to be together, working with the health ministers, working with the finance ministers. We had a great session yesterday on healthcare policy, where we start to talk about how the finance ministers should treat healthcare cost not as a cost anymore. It's an investment. You must invest in healthcare now, and you tackle these problems. So that's one thing. And in that area, we have actually created an initiative called Pathogen Surveillance Initiative, where we are working with Africa CDC. We are working with other stakeholders to do just that. Make sure we have access to data. Data is in one place. Especially right now, we are working on Africa continent, and people have access to that data as soon as possible to, again, respond with medical countermeasures. So that's one initiative. The other one that the forum is working on, again, with Seth and Stefan, is what you said, Michelle, to make sure that there are no disparities. So making sure that there are no disparities in vaccine access. We have an initiative called Regionalized Vaccine Manufacturing Collaborative that we are working with. Right now we have about 95 or 96 members in that. Make sure that there is vaccine manufacturing in every continent. It's impossible to do it in every country, but you can do it on every continent. And that manufacturing facility should be versatile. It can take different technologies to make vaccines. So that's the thing we are working on. I know we are out of time.
No, absolutely.
But there are some things that we can do. I mean, there are a lot of things, good things that have happened here. Seth mentioned Gavi was created here, Global Fund, many other things were created in Davos, and we want to make sure we continue the great work here, working with all of you. So thank you. Thanks, everyone, for being here.
Thank you very much.
See you again.
And it certainly does take a step beyond the spectator piece to clarify. So I think, as you said, you were going to say what you think, and I think we've had a chance to hear it. Before I drill down on that one, let me just turn to Asia, since the time is short. You've been involved in the whole question of China and its role in the world, including its relation with the US, since you and Nixon went to China to open relations with China now a half century ago. When that began, if one of the clear irreconcilable differences among the parties at that time were the views about Taiwan. But in the Shanghai Communique and in the framework of strategic ambiguity that you and Zhou Enlai and company wove, irreconcilables didn't turn out to be unmanageables. And somehow the 5 decades since then have actually seen better increases in the lives and well-being of people on both sides of the straits than in any equivalent period in their history. So on the other hand, this situation is heating up where you can see some political impulses in the US even calling for recognition of Taiwan as an independent country, something that you've said and that I have written as well. I cannot imagine any Chinese leader abiding. So what about the Asian front? And also from a historical perspective.
When President Nixon began to move together with Chairman Mao towards progress in the American-Chinese relationship, there had been 162 negotiations about Taiwan in Warsaw, which ended very quickly on each occasion because each side put forward the proposals that the other side would not accept. We began the process because we were convinced that the American people should be given a vision of peace that was not defined by the Vietnam War, but that showed prospects of constructive relationships developing even among societies that had ideologically substantial differences. China felt itself at the same time under pressure from Russia and considered it to its own advantage to open a dialogue with the United States. For 5 decades, this process operated effectively. The issue of Taiwan was put under arrangements under which the Taiwan could develop economically, politically, without the affirmation by the United States of a separate China.
Claims because the statistics of the World Bank and the IMF, as well as the
продовольствию, ФАО и других международных структур, говорит, что кризис назревал задолго до начала
other international structures have been indicating that the crisis had been developing even before the beginning of the special military operation, and President Putin had given data about the situation in the world economy being entirely due to the selfish position of the United States and its allies. What is going on in Ukraine at the moment arose from the United States and its satellites' years-long preparation to starting a global hybrid war against the Russian Federation. And no one is even trying to disguise that. If you read statements by Western politicians, political scientists, you can easily see that for yourself. A few days ago, a professor of the University of Columbia was published, and he said we were not in a Cold War with Russia he said, we are in a hot war with Russia, and NATO is fighting Russia in Ukraine. These confessions are quite obvious. They are on the surface level, and it is bizarre to see various attempts to deny that. And President Milanovic of Croatia recently said that it was NATO's war. He was frank and honest when he said that. A few weeks ago, Henry Kissinger, before calling upon the world calling upon NATO to make Ukraine another member, in one of his most recent articles, he said that what was going on in Ukraine was a clash and competition between two nuclear powers for control over this territory. I believe it is quite clear what this was all about. That is why when our Western partners foam at the mouth, trying to prove that they had nothing to do with that, they only try to help Ukraine overcome aggression and restore its territorial integrity, they are not being entirely truthful. The amount of their military support testify that the West is banking a lot on this war against Russia. It is quite clear because the events in Ukraine shed light on the United States' desire to seize, trying using legitimate means to strengthen its world positions and take up illegitimate methods for ensuring its dominance. They spare no effort. It's not just what we see in Ukraine. They also destroyed all those mechanisms that the West, headed by the US, created, the mechanisms of the free market, loyal competition, free entrepreneurship, presumption of innocence, inviolability of private property. Everything that the Western globalization model was founded on has collapsed. And right now, sanctions are being used against Russia and other undesirable states simply because they refuse to comply with their ideas. But tomorrow, these sanctions can be used against any other country that refuses to blindly follow American orders. As for the European Union, I don't think we need to speak about that. For a long time, the EU is now completely following the American dictate, and this process that has been fomenting for a few years has recently culminated in a joint declaration between NATO and the EU. It happened on the 10th of January, and the declaration said that NATO and the EU will use all of their economic and military means in the interests of the Golden Billion, in the interests of our 1 billion of citizens of NATO and EU countries. According to Burrell, the rest of the world is the jungle that is in the way of the development of this blossoming garden, and this jungle needs to be reformatted, needs to be turned into a colony of the new formation and get resources from them using new methods. Blackmail, demonization, and sanctions, threat of use of force, those are some of the methods they use to achieve their goals. The West has taken up the policy of destroying the traditional ties between historic partners in various parts of the world and destabilization of various regions. We see it in the Balkans, in the post-Soviet space, especially if we consider the activities of the United States and its acolytes and clients in South Caucasus, and naturally everything that is going on in Ukraine that has been developing for a long time. For example, in 2004, when the first Maidan took place, European officials said for the first time, Ukraine needs to choose. Is
И
it
с тех пор
with
это
the West
или-или
or is it with Russia? This
политика
either-or
Запада по
policy
отношению
has
к
been
этому
visible in
региону
the West's
последовательно.
policy
Те,
regarding
кто
this region
выбирал
in a
неправильные
consistent manner,
или
and those
и
who
рассчитывал,
made the wrong
что все-таки
choice
его исторические
and
узы, родственные связи,
wanted
традиции,
historic ties
религиозные
and
убеждения
brotherhood
связывают его с
traditions
Российской Федерацией,
and
хотя он,
religious
наверное,
ties
живет
with
на Украине.
Russia
Их
matter.
поначалу более-менее деликатно, а в конце уже
Initially,
безжалостно перемалывали,
the
исключали
West
из политической
would
жизни,
crush them.
применяли к ним
They
меры
would try to
уголовного
exclude them
преследования.
from political
Это
life.
включало и
They would
убийство
prosecute them.
непокорных журналистов
They
и
would
политиков,
assassinate
закрытие средств массовой информации,
journalists and
которые не отражали
politicians.
официальной
They would
точки
shut
зрения.
down
Ну, в
media
общем, создание
outlets if they refused
полицейского
to
нацистского
spread
государства
the official
шло полным
position.
ходом, и
The police state
сейчас оно, по
used
сути
all
дела,
means
завершено с
available, and right
благословения
now the
Запада.
process is
Поэтому
over
вот эти вот
with the silent approval of the West.
альтернативы, либо с
And the
Западом, либо с Россией,
alternative
они
choice,
были
either or
нужны для того,
West or
чтобы
Russia,
выявить тех, кто не с Западом, кто
were
против
needed
Запада.
to identify
И
those
их
who were
стали
against the
активно и
West,
активно
who were
наказывать.
not with the West.
И, конечно же, вот
And the
возвращаясь к
West
декларации
started
НАТО и
punishing
Евросоюза, очень интересный
these
документ.
people.
Эти
And let's
две
get back to the
структуры, НАТО
declaration. It's an
и
interesting paper
ЕС,
indeed.
объявлены
And
союзом
the EU and
демократий
NATO
против
were
автократий
proclaimed
в
to be
условиях
an alliance
глобального
of democracies
соперничества.
against autocracies
Заведомо
amid global
конфронтационная повестка
competition.
дня
This
провозглашена
confrontational
на
agenda
весь мир.
was proclaimed for the entire world
При
to
этом, как
hear.
я уже сказал, Европа
And just like I have
свою
already pointed out,
самостоятельность
Europe has lost its
совместная декларация
independence,
прямо
and the joint declaration
ставит европейцев в
explicitly
подчиненное положение по отношению к
states that
Североатлантическому альянсу.
Europeans are
По сути
subjugated
дела,
to
подтягивает их,
NATO,
содержит их обязательства,
essentially containing an
обеспечивает
obligation
обслуживание
to
американских интересов
serve
в деле
American
геополитического
interests
сдерживания
in
России и
geopolitical
Китая.
containment of Russia and
И в
China.
целом провозглашена цель, которая
They
была
also
всем уже
proclaimed
известна, но она сейчас
the
уже
goal that was well
задокументирована в
known to
очередной раз.
everyone, but now they put it
Достижение
on
глобального
paper,
превосходства
achieving
Североатлантического
global
альянса во главе
superiority
с
of
американцами.
NATO headed
НАТО
by
не
the United States.
ограничивается организацией
NATO
жизни
does not
европейского
restrict
континента.
itself to
Еще с
simply
мадридского
organizing
саммита, который
Europe.
состоялся в июне прошлого года,
During the Madrid summit that
провозглашена
took place in
глобальная
June
ответственность
2022, they
этого
proclaimed global
военного блока,
responsibility of this military
особенно в
bloc,
отношении
especially when it comes to
Азиатско-Тихоокеанского
the
региона,
Asia-Pacific region
который натовцы называют
that
Индо-Тихоокеанским
NATO chooses
регионом.
to
Здесь
call
понятно,
the
попытка заигрывать
Indo-Pacific. Here, the
с
attempt
Индией
is
для того,
clear.
чтобы
They are trying to
вносить
involve India in
дополнительные
this
сложности в
process in
отношениях с
order to
Китайской
further
Народной Республикой.
complicate their
Ну
relations
и
with China.
провозглашен лозунг
Moreover, they
неделимости
also proclaimed
безопасности в Евроатлантике.
indivisibility of security in the Euro-Atlantic and the
Такая игра слов.
Indo-Pacific.
Если мы
A
раньше
play upon
в
words.
ОБСЕ и в
Previously,
Совете России
in the
НАТО
OSCE and the
90-х
Russian
годов
NATO Council,
записывали
starting from
клятвенную
1990s,
приверженность
we would
принципу неделимости
speak
безопасности,
about
который
indivisibility
означал
of
равную
security,
безопасность
which
для
meant
каждого
equal
государства
security for each state,
и обязательство не укреплять свою безопасность
and
за
the
счет
obligation not
безопасности других,
to
то
strengthen
теперь
your security at
сам
the expense
термин,
of the security of
выдернут из
others.
контекста, ему
This term
придано новое
is
значение.
now used out of
Неделимость
context and has
интересов
taken on
НАТО
a new
и
meaning, the
Индо-Тихоокеанского региона.
indivisibility of
Разницу,
security
конечно, вы
interests of NATO and the
замечаете, и это
Indo-Pacific.
понятно. В
The difference
Индо-Тихоокеанском
is
регионе,
clear
как его
for
называют,
everyone. The so-called
западники взят
Indo-Pacific,
курс на создание
the
блоковой
West
архитектуры против
has
России и
embarked
Китайской
upon
Народной
the path
Республики.
of creating
С
a
этой
bloc
целью
against Russia and China.
разрушаются
In order to do
последовательно,
that,
хотя
they
и
have been consistently destroying
предпочитают молчать, те механизмы, те
various
форматы
mechanisms
сотрудничества,
and
которые
cooperation
десятилетиями создавались
mechanisms
вокруг АСЕАН на
that
принципах равноправия,
have been
на
created
принципах поиска
in
консенсуса, баланса
ASEAN on the
интересов.
basis of
Вместо
equality,
этого создаются
consensus,
военные
balance
блоки.
of interests. They
Ярчайший
substitute them
пример
with
AUKUS,
military blocks.
англосаксонский блок
AUKUS is a bright
Азии,
example of that, an Anglo-Saxon
Соединенные
bloc
Штаты,
in Asia,
Британия
the
и
US, the
Австралия.
UK, and
В
Australia.
этот блок активно втягивают
They
Японию
actively involved
и
Japan
недавний
in this
визит
bloc, and
премьер-министра Кисиды в Вашингтон
Prime Minister
завершился
Kishida's recent
подтверждением
visit
этого
to
курса.
Washington
Япония
became the
вновь идет по пути
culmination of this
милитаризации.
policy. Japan has once again embarked upon the path of militarization. They are going to change and amend its constitution, in particular the articles that prevented it from doing that. The process has started. I'm not going to go into detail about the activities of the West at other geopolitical tracks, but speaking briefly about the position of the United States and the West that we consider to be the main problem creating difficulties everywhere, it can be summed up as follows. Washington's line of ensuring dictate in international affairs means the following. We Americans are allowed to do whatever we want, wherever we want, even if it's at the other end of the world. We will do what we deem necessary, and you, all others, cannot do anything without our consent, even if you respond to direct threats to your security that we create at your borders. I'm simplifying it, of course. Just like Napoleon mobilized the entirety of Europe against the Russian Empire, just like Hitler mobilized most European countries and made them fight against the Soviet Union, the US has now shaped a coalition, including virtually all European countries, both NATO member states, and others, including EU member states. And now they are waging a war by proxy against Russia, using Ukraine as a proxy, in order to solve the Russian matter, just like Hitler wanted to find a final solution to the Jewish problem. They are doing the same right now. If we read statements by politicians, not only from Baltic states, but also some more moderate ones, they say that Russia needs to be defeated on the strategical level. Political scientists from various media outlets speak about decolonizing Russia, alleging that Russia is too big and is in the way. A few days ago, I read an article published in The Telegraph calling upon the world to liberate Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria, leaving Karelia, Königsberg, and Kurils up to negotiations. Of course, it's a tabloid. And sometimes we are forced to read such tabloids because they make headlines from time to time. But no one in the West, and such remarks are very numerous, including in our non-systemic opposition. No one among Western politicians refutes such claims.
President Macron, in addition to his project of European political community, which has been directly proclaimed to be the format where all Europeans, except for Ukrainians and Belarusians, will be invited to. Now I've heard a new idea that he pitched to call a European State Conference. An invitation will be received by the EU, Eastern Partnership participants, that is Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, as well as Moldova, Ukraine, and Belarus. I doubt that they will invite Belarus. Still, it was said it would be the EU, Eastern Partnership countries, plus, and I'd like to point it out here, immigrants from the Russian Federation, which are actively engaged in politics abroad. Also, it was said not in the presentation by President Macron, but in the comments that followed later, that this event, the Conference of European States, could also invite separate regions of the Russian Federation, which intend to maintain their ties with Europe. I think it's clear what we're talking about. The situation is far from black and white as it is painted by our Western colleagues. It reflects the general line towards global dominance, an absolute submission of everyone, with a threat of punishment, as you can see. None of the Western politicians is talking about nothing but sanctions. Right now in Davos, Ursula von der Leyen, yet again, was threatening us and Belarus with new sanctions. We know how to introduce more sanctions, how to suffocate Russian economy, for it to be brought back into recession for decades. That's what we're talking about. And, well, there was a saying that the masks are off, and for the longest time, when there were discussions at the UN Security Council about sanctions, about a country which would probably violate their international obligations. And at that point, every time the Western countries who initiated these sanctional measures, they were saying that the sanctions are not for punishing the nation, the population of the state. These are sanctions against the regimes. So where are these assurances now? The sanctions against Russia are openly declared to be aimed at the people conducting a revolution against the current leaders of Russia. No holds barred. No one is observing any politeness rules here anymore. Well, this frenzied attempt, this response by hook or by crook, using barred holds to ensure the domination of the U.S. and the rest of the world, the rest of the West that Washington has completely steamrolled over. This frenzy shows that historically they're acting on the wrong side of history. And in essence are trying to stop the formation of the multipolar world. And that is not happening by decisions from cabinets in Potomac or on the Potomac River, or well, this is happening just naturally because countries are developing economically. Take China, take India, our strategic partners. Look at Turkey, Brazil, Argentina, Egypt, many other countries that have great potential. For example, in Africa, they have tremendous reserves of raw materials. There are new centers of economic growth being formed, and the West is trying to hinder that, using the mechanisms that were created to serve their interests through the globalization that was created by them. And here, the role of the dollars or reserve currencies has one of the main roles to play. Therefore, now, in our context with the SCO and within BRICS and other associations, CIS, naturally, Eurasian Economic Union as well as in the cooperation with associations with Asia, Africa, and Latin America, they're trying to build new forms of interaction so as not to depend on the West. And it's clear, neo-colonial methods. President Putin has spoken about that very clearly. These methods are being used to plunder the rest of the world. Now, in new conditions, we, together with our reliable partners, with friendly countries, will build such interaction that would benefit us and will be exempt from the influence from those who would like to subjugate the rest of the world. These are my evaluations of the past year. The main thing is that the processes that this year saw, they were incepted many years ago. It wasn't yesterday. And these processes will continue to unravel because the shaping of the multipolar world, its finalization of the relations that are required for democracy in the world and justice to reign in the world, for the UN Charter to be observed, about respect for sovereign equality of all states. That would take time.
Устав ООН – это очень хорошая база.
The UN Charter is a
Он,
great
когда был
foundation.
принят, он действительно был революционным
When it was
документом.
adopted, it was indeed a revolutionary document. Unfortunately, all those right principles were distorted by the West. The West did not respect the sovereign equality principle. They did not respect non-interference in domestic affairs principle, peaceful settling of disputes, and so on. Hundreds of times after the UN was created, the US have used their armed forces abroad, in the majority of cases, in blatant violation of the UN Charter. Therefore, the process of multipolar world taking shape will take time. That will be a whole historical era. Right now, we're in the middle of this process. Sometimes it's hard to see when you're inside the process. Therefore, we keep in touch, we exchange opinions and evaluations, and we appreciate that. That goes not only to our partners in foreign countries, but also to our colleagues from the media. Your observations and even the questions that you're asking us are very useful. So let's move on to your questions then. RIA Novosti, please. Thank you very much. Christina Lund Rodriguez, RIA Novosti. Mr. Minister, how do you evaluate the chances that this year will be possible to organize negotiations between Russia and the leading Western countries led by the US dedicated to Ukraine? What questions of ensuring security as part of the Ukrainian settlement would Moscow like to put on the table for these negotiations? Do you think that it will be possible that this year, this active phase, the military phase will stop this year? As for the military phase, an active phase, well, our military and our president have commented on that multiple times, and he confirmed yet again that the special military operation has its goals. They're not just invented or taken out of thin air, but they are defined by the deeply rooted and legitimate interests in security of the Russian Federation, the interests of the Russian position in the world and our nearest neighborhood. Ukraine, just like any other territory that is bordering Russia, there should be no military, should have no military infrastructure that poses a direct military threat to Russia. In Ukraine, there should be no discrimination and persecution aimed against our compatriots who happened to be Ukrainian citizens, but like to maintain their language, culture, and traditions, and would like to bring up their children in these traditions. And I would like to highlight, in full compliance with the Constitution of the Ukraine, which states that Ukraine guarantees free development and protection of Russian and other languages of the ethnic minorities in the Ukraine. Russian is mentioned there specifically. This constitution is still in place. As far as I understand, we have handout materials. Okay, so they were circulated yesterday. So we have materials circulating that mention the articles of the Constitution and specific Ukrainian commitments according to international conventions. We also have a hefty list of the laws that were adopted in the violation of both the Constitution and the international obligations of the Ukrainian state. Some time ago, about several months ago, I was surprised to read an interview by President Zelensky. He spoke on the topic that if they let Russia win, then other big countries would think that they can do that too. And there are many such countries and different continents. Therefore, Such countries will suffocate small countries, will divvy up the rest. And I, said Zelensky, I would like to see a different scenario when each person on the planet would know that regardless of where he lives, he has the same kind of rights and he's protected just like any person in the world. So this was said by a person, well, the interview took place in October. And in September, in 2021, a year before that, Zelensky, as you know, said that in the East, there are just species, not people. And if any citizens of Ukraine thinks in Russian language and would like to stay Russian, then for the benefit of his children and grandchildren, he should move out to Russia. So this was said by the same person who said that he has a dream about equality and so that everyone could live the way he wants. It's clear that these beautiful words are said for the benefit of the West. But that gives us a great picture of the current regime, and it's clear why we cannot abandon the foundational, the basic goals of the special military operation. As for the outlook for the negotiations, we've discussed it dozens of times. I don't want to repeat some platitudes, starting with March, when we reciprocated Ukraine's appeal for negotiations. Moreover, we supported the draft settlement document proposed by Ukraine, but Ukraine was stopped. It was told it was too early. And after the spring of this year, throughout the summer and the fall, special representatives were saying that everywhere that it's too early to move to negotiations, that Ukraine needs more armaments for it to start its negotiation with a greater initial ask. NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg said that this is the path to peace. And Zelensky is pitching very strange initiatives, 10-point plans with everything kicked over: food security, energy security, biosecurity, withdrawal of Russian troops from everywhere, Russian repentance, tribunal, condemnation, and so on and so forth. There could be no negotiation with Zelensky because he prohibited it by law to hold negotiations with the Russian government. So all of this Western talk that they are allegedly prepared, but Russia is not, well, this is not entire truth. You asked about the outlook for negotiations between Russia and the West. We will be prepared for any serious proposals. We'll be prepared to respond to them, and we see no serious proposals as of now, but we'll be prepared to review them and to think about it. We see the mantra from the Western capitals that Ukraine should not be discussed without the presence of Ukraine. And this is just gibberish, because the West decides for Ukraine. They banned Zelensky from negotiating with Russia at the end of March last year, when there was a prepared agreement. So the West is deciding, and it decided that for Ukraine, without Ukraine. They're saying it's not the time. There should be more armaments. We should weaken Russia more. I don't know who's in charge of the military planning there, but there was a meeting between CIA Director Bill Burns and Sergei Naryshkin, Director of SVR Russia. He spoke about the meeting in general terms. It was proposed by President Biden, and President Putin agreed. This meeting took place. There were no revelations made there. In general, the West, in some sporadic contacts that happen at this or that level, does not say anything that would go beyond its public statements.
Наша позиция хорошо известна.
Our position is well known.
Но говорить с Западом только по Украине
But talking to the West
это
about Ukraine only
бессмысленно. Запад
makes no sense,
использует
really.
Украину для
The West
разрушения
is using
системы
Ukraine to
безопасности,
dismantle
которая
the security
существовала в
system that
Евроатлантике
used to
долгие-долгие
exist
годы,
in Euro-Atlantic
которая
region for many
зиждилась на
years.
принципах
It was
консенсуса,
underpinned
неделимости
by the principle of
безопасности,
consensus, indivisibility
решения
of
всех
security,
вопросов через диалог и
solving all
сотрудничество.
issues through dialogue
И
and cooperation.
воплощением этих идеалов была
And the
Организация
embodiment
по безопасности и
of these
сотрудничеству в Европе,
principles were
которую
the
сейчас
OSCE.
Запад усиленно хоронит.
Right now, the West is trying to bury it as soon as possible, just as it has buried the Council of Europe. Organizations that were created for dialogue and for finding consensus, for finding compromise, by definition, are now being used to promote the very line towards total domination of the US with the rest of the West under them.
Говорить с нами, вот давайте хорошо с Украиной что-нибудь там
okay,
придумаем,
let's do something
все
about Ukraine,
остальное
but the
будет
rest
наше. Нет, нужен будет
will be
честный
ours.
разговор.
Well, no,
И я думаю, в
that would not
принципе, на
go.
данном
We
этапе
would have to have a
нам
frank
нет
conversation.
нужды какие-то
And I don't think
инициативы
that at this
проявлять в
stage we
таких
need to show
направлениях, которые
any
Запад
initiative
сам закрыл.
in those dimensions
В том
that the West
числе
has closed down.
закрыл взаимодействие в Совете Европы,
They
которым
closed
так
down
все гордились.
cooperation
Более
in the
того,
Council
в
of
Совете
Europe
Европы есть
that
несколько
everyone was so
конвенций,
proud of.
десятков
Besides,
конвенций,
Council
которые
of Europe
не
has
требуют
several dozen conventions
быть
that do
членом
not
Совета
require
Европы, но
a
позволяют
country to be a
участвовать в
member
этих
of the
конвенциях.
Council of Europe,
Так вот,
but
Запад
allow
и
you to
здесь
take
решил отменять Россию
part in those,
и
to be party to
строит
that convention. And
дискриминационные
here,
препятствия
the
для
West
участия
decided to
наших
discriminate
представителей
against
в
Russia
работе
once again
соответствующих
and prevent
органов
our
вот
representatives
этих
from taking
конвенций,
part
которые открыты для
in the
нечленов
bodies
Совета Европы.
of
В этой
those conventions which are
ситуации,
open for non-members.
по сути дела, выдвигают неприемлемые условия
In this
участия наших
situation,
представителей
our
в отчетных
representatives have no
мероприятиях. В этих
chance of
условиях
taking
мы,
part in
конечно, с этим
review
мириться не
events,
будем. Вот
and
недавно по этой
in
причине
these
вышли
conditions,
из
we have,
конвенции
are impossible
о
to act
противодействии
in.
коррупции.
Therefore, we have exited out
Это
of
не
the
значит, что мы
criminal
перестали
law
бороться с коррупцией, а значит только одно, что
convention
мы
on
не хотим
corruption. We,
в
that doesn't mean
соответствующем
that we
органе
don't want to fight
сидеть на
corruption, but
приставном
that means
стуле
that we would
и
just means that we don't want to be
западные нотации, когда мы
disregarded
будем
by the West and
ущемлены
admonished by the
в
West
своих
in that
процедурных
format
правах.
when we don't even have
Ну, я могу
procedural
долго
rights.
примеры приводить.
I can give
Давайте,
you plenty of examples, but
чтобы
let's move
поживее
on to
кто-то еще
to
последний
make it
задаст.
a bit more lively.
Да, пожалуйста,
Other questions, please.
Греция, Украина.
Greece, please. Open TV.
Афанасий Евгений, ну, с Open TV Греция. Вы знаете, существует такое мнение среди многих
You know, there is an
европейцев,
opinion among many
что Россия
Europeans
не проявила свою
that
лучшую
Russia
сторону,
did
решая
not
пойти
put its best foot
на
forward
военные
when it
действия.
decided to start military action.
Ну, и что таким образом выступает как
And therefore,
остальные
Russia is acting
империалистические
like the
страны,
rest of imperialistic
допустим,
countries.
Соединенные Штаты,
For
которые
example, the
упомянули,
US,
которые, кстати, разбомбили почти
who, by
половину
the way, have
планеты,
bombed half of the planet
что
almost.
таким же образом нарушает международное право,
So Russia is also violating
действуя
international law in the same
таким
way
образом, чтобы захватить определенные
and
территории.
acts in the way to conquer certain
И,
territories.
знаете, такая критика очень слышим в Греции, на Кипре,
Such
на
criticism is
Балканах,
very vocal
упомянули
in
Балканы,
Greece, in the
в
Balkan
связи с
region.
тем, что мы
You've
тоже
mentioned it.
жертвы такой
Due to the
политики.
fact that we're also victims
Вы
of such
изучили
policy.
знатоков, наверное,
You
кипрского вопроса.
probably know the
Есть
Cyprus
угрозы в
issue the
Эгейском море
best.
со
There
стороны
is a threat
Турции
in the
против
Aegean
Греции.
Sea
И вот такая формулировка,
against
такая
Greece
аргументация очень у
from
нас звучит.
Turkey. And
Как
we
бы
hear
поспорили,
this a
если
lot,
можно,
this opinion a lot.
такой
How would
позицией?
you refute this position?
Я не то, что буду спорить, я просто
Well, it's not that
изложу
I'm
свое
going to
мнение.
refute this position. I'm going to
Когда
express
сказали,
my
что
own
Россия
opinion
не проявила свои лучшие
when
качества,
they say
когда
that Russia
началась
did not put
специальная
its
военная
best foot
операция.
forward when
Такая
it
интересная
started
формулировка.
the special military operation. I would say that this is a very interesting turn of phrase. But, you know, just
Мы свои
to
лучшие
dot
качества
all the I's, I
проявляли,
think we put
ну,
our best foot forward once the USSR disappeared, and this was mentioned by President Putin on many occasions. In 2000, when he was first elected as president, one of the first visits was to Germany, where he spoke in Bundestag, he spoke German. And in doing so, he personally, as a person, a human being, as President Putin, he committed himself to a historic reconciliation between Germany and our country. And this reconciliation dated back to the end of 1980s, beginning of 1990s, once the Berlin Wall fell. But that was at the official level, at the state level, whereas President Putin made a personal human contribution to this historic reconciliation between the two countries. Don't forget that Germany reunited to a large extent thanks to the USSR position, because other countries, the allied nations, were not that enthusiastic about that. And we were putting our best foot forward, as you put it, from the point of view of international law, from the point of view of searching for solutions that would benefit the whole humankind. And we've been doing that for quite some time. I cited the first Ukrainian Maidan back in 2004. The official Europe back then said that the Ukraine was up for a choice, either Europe or something else, but that was 3 years before the Munich speech, and we were hopeful back then that reason would prevail and Europe would understand that it was impossible to constantly lie, to constantly push NATO eastward, despite the assurances that had been provided that it would. And was impossible to do that, not just despite the assurances given in private, but also due to the obligations under the OEC principles, when you shouldn't reinforce your security at the expense of other security, and when no one can, claim dominance. And these are the principles that are enshrined in the OEC, and Russia and Europe are part of that. And the very same formula has been enshrined in the documents adopted at the NATO-Russia Council at the highest level. And if you think that reckless NATO push eastward, despite our official remonstrance, is the implementation of this very obligation, when I think it's not going to be possible for us to reach common understanding. But I think you understand full well what I'm talking about. You said that we acted as the other imperialist nations. Right now, we are often, once again, dubbed an empire, but it's up to the experts, to professionals, to speculate on that. We're a nation, a country, which is home to many nationalities and ethnic groups. We have 150 or so languages. All the world religions are represented among our population. We have respect for national traditions of each and every ethnic group, and as a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country, we have been developing, following this pattern for centuries. And unlike Western colonial practices, we have never suppressed nations that were part of the Russian Empire. And we never destroyed them, never tried to put them into a melting pot for them to lose identity, national culture, to become, as Americans, one homogeneous nation. Even Americans failed to do that, and we never sought that. We managed to preserve our national traditions, national identity, specificities, our national languages. As far as the conquest of territories is concerned, as far as what you said, that we have the same very instincts as Western empires, I would say the following. As I mentioned, the U.S., after the end of the Cold War,
90-й год,
well, let's take 1990. After that, the US
в большинстве случаев
invaded other territories for
цель была
300 times or so.
либо там кого-то из американцев кто-то обидел, это регулярно
Why did they
происходит
do that? Either
в
because
Центральной Америке, в
someone
частности.
offended the Americans, this happens regularly
Либо целью
in Central
было
America or in the Caribbean,
ликвидировать угрозы
or they sought
миру
to
и безопасности.
eliminate threats to
Например,
peace and security.
Саддам Хусейн.
To cite an
якобы
example,
имел оружие
Saddam
массового
Hussein, who
Потом
allegedly
оказалось,
was in
что
possession of the
Ливия
BMDs,
просто
which
захотели
turned out to be a
Каддафи,
fabrication,
который
or Libya,
оказался
when they
не
wanted to
демократом, а
eliminate
диктатором.
Gaddafi,
Разрушили
who
Ирак и
was not a
Ливию.
Democrat but
Благополучные
a
страны,
dictator.
которые жили
So they
весьма
destroyed
неплохо с точки зрения
prosperous
социально-экономической
countries
ситуации.
who were not
Югославии-
that bad from the point of view of the
Югославии просто
economic development. Let's take
решили
Yugoslavia.
развалить Балканы,
They simply
в том
decided
числе в угоду
to
Германии, между
dismantle
прочим,
the Balkans,
которая
in
не стала
particular to
даже
please
ждать, пока Евросоюз
Germany.
выработает единую линию, а
They
просто взяла и
did not
признала
wait
Хорватию и Словению,
for
и тем самым
a coordinated
сделала
line
процесс
by the
необратимым,
EU. They
отрубила все
simply
возможности хоть как-то
recognized
воссоздать
Slovenia and Croatia,
конфедеративный или какой-то иной
which
формат
made it
между
impossible
балканскими странами.
to rebuild any kind of
И
confederation
Сербия
and the Balkans.
противилась
Serbia
тому, что Балканы должны подчиниться
was
Западу.
against that.
что
It was
Сербия
against the
сделала?
idea of the
Кстати,
Balkans submitting to
Джо
the
Байден,
West.
будучи
So
сенатором,
what did they do?
еще за
Incidentally,
год
when
до
Joseph
начала
Biden was
натовской
still
агрессии против Сербии
senator, a year
заявлял в
prior
98 году,
to the NATO
Я
aggression against
выступаю за
Serbia in
то, чтобы не
1997,
бомбили
he said,
Я предлагаю
I am in
послать
favor of
американских
bombing
пилотов и
Belgrade.
взорвать
I
все мосты
suggest
через
American
реку Двина.
pilots have
Я
to
предлагаю
go and
изъять
destroy
у них
all
все
the bridges
запасы
across
нефти,
the
просто отнять.
Drina. I suggest that
И,
we take all
как вы видите, все
their
требования
oil
сенатора
reserves,
Байдена
just to take
через
away
год,
that from them. And
1999
as
году
you
были
see,
исполнены.
all the
А
proposals
журнал
of
«Тайм»
Senator Biden
в то время
were
вышел с
implemented a
обложки.
year after,
Через
and
массовые
the
бомбардировки
Time
к миру и
was
демократии.
published, a new
И
edition,
ничего,
and
никакие
it
там
had the cover
трибуналы,
saying
никто об этом не думал,
through
никто не
mass
думал ни о
bombings
каких
to
трибуналах,
democracy. And
когда
back then,
США
not a
в
single
Сирии
person
вторглись без
was thinking about a
такого
tribunal,
легитимного основания.
when
И
the
стали
US
сравнивать с землей
invaded
города.
Syria
Например,
without
город
any
Рак, который
legitimate cause,
полностью
starting
уничтожен, и там
to
десятки,
raise
сотни
cities
трупов
to the ground.
лежали без
Cities were
какого-либо
destroyed,
ухода,
eliminated.
месяцами.
Raqqa
И,
was razed to the
да, там международная
ground.
общественность,
Bodies
какие-то
were piled up,
врачи без границ,
and
репортеры без
they
границ что-то где-то сказали.
stayed in the streets for
Но
months. Yes, there
ни о
was
каких
some
трибуналах
reports
речи не
by
было.
Médecins Sans
Когда,
Frontières, by
когда
others,
Международный
but
уголовный суд
never
вдруг сам
was
решил
a tribunal proposed.
заняться
But
расследованием
when the International Court
данных
itself
о совершении
decided
американцами
to
в
look
Афганистане военных преступлений,
into potential
Соединенные Штаты просто
military
сказали
crimes
Международному уголовному суду,
that
мы
might have been committed
всех
by
вас
the
посадим под
American
санкции, деньги ваши
military
отнимем, которые в
in
американских банках.
Afghanistan. The US
И
said
все,
that we're going to
этот высокий
slap
орган
sanctions on you,
международной
we'll
юстиции
take away
просто
your money.
замолчал.
And this high institution of
поэтому
international justice
Можно
decided to keep
сравнивать,
mum.
конечно, но мы
Yes, you can draw a
защищали,
comparison.
как я уже
That's true.
сказал, что мы
But
защищали
as I
свою
said,
безопасность,
we
потому
have
что
been
из
protecting
Украины
our
делали
own security
делали
because
плацдарм
Ukraine
для
was being turned
нападения на
into
Россию, для подрыва наших интересов.
a bridgehead
Уже в Азовском море
to
планировались
undermine our interests in the Sea of Azov. There were plans to build military naval bases, Anglo-Saxon bases in particular. And
И,
these are
во-вторых,
serious
конечно же,
threats.
унижение русских,
Secondly, the
которым
humiliation of
Конституция
Russians
Украины гарантирует
that
их права.
allegedly have to
неприемлемо,
have their
потому что
rights
они наши
protected
соотечественники,
under the
они связывают с
Ukrainian
нами
constitution. And
защиту
this humiliation
своих
was
законных
inadmissible
интересов,
because
гарантированных, еще раз
they
пишу, Конституцией Украины.
associate
Когда
the protection
инспирированный Западом
with us,
госпереворот
the protection of their
2014 году
legitimate interests. When in
никаким образом
2014,
не
a
вызвал
West-inspired
даже попытки
coup
наладить
d'etat happened,
общенациональный диалог на Украине,
they didn't
когда
even
Запад
make an effort
однозначно
to
встал
build
на сторону
an
режима,
national dialogue.
провозгласившего
The
свои
West
антироссийские цели, сразу
sided with the regime that declared anti-Russian goals, that declared its commitment to the principles and practices of Nazism, when they bombed Odessa, when they bombed Luhansk, and no one is investigating these crimes. And there are no suggestions to set up tribunals for that. Lastly, a war was started against those who disagreed with the coup d'etat, then the war was stopped, the Minsk agreements were signed, but as you know, Germany and France with Poroshenko, all the three signatories, except Putin, well, they signed it to better prepare Ukraine with weapons and equipment for the next phase. So do you think we didn't put our best foot forward in this particular case, because we were the only country that sought to make sure that the Minsk agreements were observed, whereas the others were not so enthusiastic and were simply following the advice from the US. And I think that, well, Greece and Cyprus are suffering because of that. I don't know what they are most suffering from, because Greece and Cyprus and Russia have always been very close friends, and the transformations that have happened in the leadership of both countries have not gone unnoticed by us. As far as everything that I've just mentioned is concerned, I can say the following. For many years, they have been preparing these efforts, preparing forces to unleash a hybrid warfare against us. And this is all, well, no, I think prime ministers and presidents of European countries, especially countries that have had long-standing historical ties with Russia, I'm confident that these people know the facts and they know how to analyze that. So, given that, the conclusion I can draw is quite clear. Either they were made or they willingly submitted to the diktat by the US. Europe is following the US orders, and there is not going to be any talk of any strategic autonomy or independence in Europe. They will not be allowed to do that. When Defense Secretary Mr. Austin of the US said that more American troops had to move to Europe, he was asked whether that would be on a permanent basis, on a rotation basis, and he said, we are going to decide that in Washington. So we are drawing the conclusions from what's happening. And of course, we have taken note of those who were so hasty to support the aggression against Russia. The war is going to be over sometime, and we'll defend our truth. But what comes next, I do not quite understand yet. It's all going to be dependent on the conclusions that Europe is going to draw. Georgia, please. Alt info.
Tools with our IFIs partners, how we can facilitate Ukrainian business to develop, and how we can facilitate foreign investment to come to Ukraine even now with different mechanisms such as insurance for the war risks, for example, or some additional finance that can be provided.
Thank you. Can I just have a small follow-up question on the peace formula?
Yes.
The First Lady spent quite a long time on it in her speech. I think she also mentioned, if I understood correctly, that Ukraine is working with as many countries as it can to develop it or implement it. Could you just elaborate a little bit on the process?
So at the end of February is going to be a special session of United Nations when the President Zelensky will discuss how we might implement together with our partners this peaceful formula. So it means that we would like to participate in the implementation of this peaceful formula as much countries as it possible. for all those countries that are searching for a peace for Ukraine and are able to participate. Because some, for example, agri-food security, everybody understands that it's a very practical issue, and it's about blocking of the seaports, it's about transportation routes, about warehouses. So that's why we think that it's 10 very obvious steps that can bring peace. Our idea is to find partners that will take responsibility over some of these steps. So together with Ukraine to provide us with this additional guarantee for implementation of this peaceful formula.
Very interesting. Thank you. Let me move to Mr. Chernyshov. You're heading an energy company. We have seen Ukraine's infrastructure come under severe attack, particularly since October. Nonetheless, you said last week that engineers, together with local authorities and utility workers, have restored more than 55% of energy infrastructure facilities destroyed or damaged by Russia. It's quite impressive given the circumstances. Could you just give us a sense of what is the extent of the damage that your country's energy infrastructure has undergone, and how are you working to restore access to ensure that the economy can function to the largest extent possible? Just to give us a little bit of a sense of the damage and the landscape overall on energy.
Yes, absolutely. First of all, good afternoon to everybody. I thank you, all of you, for visiting this important panel for all of us. As it is being said on the wall, World Economic Forum, the ambition and the commitment to improve the state of this world. I think this improvement might start from Ukraine and from our historical moment that we are facing together, all of us. This is not only a Ukrainian issue, and our allies are demonstrating it constantly. That is the challenge for all civilized world right now, and I believe we're going to cope with it. Coming back to energy situation, this is a full-scale war, especially starting after October 10. Russians have started actively targeting critical infrastructure, moreover, civilian critical infrastructure. Their target is to deprive Ukrainians from heating, water, gas, and other utilities. The target is to break Ukrainian spirit. The strategy will not work. This will only strengthen Ukrainian spirit to fight and to prevail. Right now, our short-term task is to survive, to go through the winter. This means more gas. This means more energy, more generators, more decentralized energy guarantee and supply. And moreover, we should go ahead and win this war. In terms of the repairs that we are doing them constantly, every day, as we are being actively attacked. And in this way, we have also done a lot of things within decentralized supply of energy, and we are planning to increase. Using this opportunity, I would like to thank you to our international allies and partners who support us in this way. And this is critical and very important for Ukraine. Of course, we are still targeting to get more gas during the course of this winter. We're targeting to get more generation equipment, to get more energy. And we expect more losses in this area. That is clear. And later on, we plan to reconstruct the whole system and to make it as modern as possible, as green as possible, and as decarbonized as possible. But this will happen after the war. Our main task right now is to win this war and to prevail in this war.
Thank you so much. Alexei, if you don't mind, just to give us a sense, for example, if you are living now in Kiev or Lviv, how much electricity do you have? Is it unless there is bombardment? How much electricity do you have? Is it unless there is bombardment you have electricity, or are there outages? Just to give a sense of people's lives in Ukraine now.
So the ordinary life in Kiev might look in the way that you might have been shortened in electricity 4 to 6 hours per day, might be more, depending on the situation with the grid and with the possibilities. It's not like constantly like this. but the most of the days we have certain shortages with electricity. We are fixing our energy system, but we all should understand the repairing of energy system is more a duct tape repairing type. Yeah. So we should really restructure and reconstruct it after the war once it is possible. But we should be proud of our infrastructure workers and employees and communal services employees who are doing all these repairs under the constant shelling, bullets, and other risk of life. We have secured 300,000 of Donbas residents in Donetsk region right now with a natural gas supply. It's a very hard job to do, very risky, but this is our target. We want to prevail. We want to win this war, and we will go ahead.
Thank you. And one more thing, on the private sector front. So we talk a lot about, I will talk about it later, public-private for reconstruction, long-term reconstruction. But is there a role for private sector actors now in providing immediate needs, particularly around energy or in general? And is it happening? Could you give us some examples?
Even business-wise?
From private sector companies?
Yeah, of course. It's a huge potential in Ukraine. It might sound ridiculous during the war. And of course, it's you should consider a risk potential. But still, the reconstruction of the country might require private equity to flow into the country. And the governmental support from Ukraine and other countries would also motivate private equity to invest into Ukraine. In terms of energy, of course, our task is to achieve energy independence level. Within the gas production, we plan to increase gas production already this year significantly, as well as constructing of decentralized energy supply. All these fields would require significant equity investors, but we should consider this in this moment, of course, under the umbrella of appropriate guarantees from the international society that would guarantee this kind of private equity investment.
Thank you so much. Turning to Vila Skinari, you are Minister for Development, Cooperation and Foreign Trade of Finland. You just visited Ukraine. So first, what is your assessment militarily, if you can share, in terms of what you saw, but also then again, those immediate needs? And you're from Finland, so it's an EU country as well. So are there things you think Europe can do even more that you learned there that we should be thinking about in Europe so that we can, again, help right now more the Ukrainian people?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. Yes, I did visit Kiev, Ukraine, a week ago, and I was very impressed when it comes to resilience and bravery of Ukrainian people, especially in the face of these recent strikes on critical infrastructure. For Finland, of course, the support of Ukraine has been very important and it's been very significant. And we distributed family housing for families in the region of Kiev to Irpin. And we also worked hard for energy supplies, different equipment generators by our rescue services. And of course, it's been very important that we've been able to act quickly, fast, and we've been able to distribute. And of course, Finland is very committed to continue our support together with our European Union allies and with our international allies as well. When it comes to reconstruction, well, of course, I want to underline, and the most important thing is to act now when the need is there. For Finland, it's been altogether last year only, and as you know, we've been supporting Ukraine since 2014. Last year, only more than 300 million euros, including material support, humanitarian, and all equipments, everything included. But of course, then we have to look at our European commitment, our development financing together with our global entities, if you like. And therefore it's so important that, for instance, here today, we are together to look at the way how we operate, how we coordinate, with what kind of emphasis we work. And of course, the most important thing is to have a dialogue with you, Ukrainians, decision makers, everybody, the people, that what are the real needs. And that's why we really, really appreciate that.
Thank you so much. Moving to Madame Renaud Basson. So you're heading an extremely important organization in terms of course, reconstruction and development globally, and you're playing such an important role in Ukraine. If my numbers are correct here, you've deployed 1.7 billion euros and a further 200 million mobilized from partner banks to support the real economy in Ukraine through investments in vital infrastructure, energy, food security, trade, and support for the private sector. A lot of people talk about we need a Marshall Plan for Ukraine. So tell us a little bit about, because you have, of course, people also that are working with you on the ground. So what is the role EBRD is playing right now in terms of these immediate needs, but also crucially then, if we say this is a Marshall Plan for Ukraine, obviously we are in the 21st century. So what are the things you're working on, and what would be things that are maybe a little different, things we should be paying attention to make it really relevant for then not only rebuilding, but building a modern economy in the 21st century Ukraine?
So thank you, but I think as it has already been said, what is very, very important is to support Ukraine now. And indeed, we need to prepare for reconstruction and to think about it and to get organized about it. But I think that the more we do now, the better. First of all, the more it will give chance to the country to win the war, and the less we will have to do in reconstruction. And in a way, it's not, I think we are in an environment which is, we already start to reconstruct everything we do in terms of emergency repair since the attack on the key infrastructure have started in October is, starting already to reconstruct. Of course, we will have to do much more later on, but really providing support now is absolutely key. At EBRD, because we are a bank focusing mainly on the private sector, what we've done this year is really to focus on the real economy. What we can do effectively to support the real economy, so the key infrastructure to keep going, and we provided financing to buy gas very early on, to support the electricity network company, and we provided now 450 million financing to the company this year, and including emergency repair in order to help them to buy generators, to buy the material they need in order to fix as quickly as possible the infrastructure, but also the railway company, and also a lot of focus on the private sector, in the agribusiness, working directly with our clients there, but also with sharing with the banking system. What is absolutely amazing, and I was in Ukraine before, in October, is the fact that everything continues to function. And we all think about, we see the very, very, devastating destruction and so forth. But when you think that the banking sector, they all have their branch opened in the country for clients, and everything function. So it's, but of course they need support, but the resilience is really impressive. So that's what we've been doing, and other IFIs have been focusing more on budget support because the government need money because of the collapse of tax revenues, because of the GDP shrinking, and also additional expenditure related to the war. So there is a good complementarity there. I think so we need to continue to do that, and we are committed to do this going next year. We've been able to do that thanks to donors and shareholder support, because for a bank, it's very challenging it's a high level risk. We are financing clients who may, for investment they are doing, which may be destroyed the day after. So their capacity to repay is not, very clear, but we have been able to take this risk, and we take half of the risk on our balance sheet, and we get donor support for the remaining 50%. And it has been a huge international effort, because we got 1.3 billion of donor support from EU countries, the US, all our shareholders. That has been very important. And I think it's important to acknowledge also the level of support received, and the mobilization for Ukraine, and that has been very important to keep going this year, and continuing to do that will be important in the future. One important dimension in the reconstruction will be the reform agenda, and we are of course, in the war, you focus on the emergency, so the deep structural reform are much more difficult to undertake. But it's important to say now we are still working a lot with our clients, for example, in the SOE sector, to ensure that good governance is there, that you have good governing body, international members for international standards for the governing, all the board members and so forth. And this is something we remain very demanding, and we will continue to do so because it's the key to ensure that the money we invest is well spent, that we continue to fight corruption and so forth. And moving forward, I think that we will have to continue to work, and this will be part of the Marshall Plan or the reconstruction plan to bring in continued transformation of the country, improve the efficiency of, public administration, even if they have in the context of the war, there has been a huge effort. For example, we have, I think the Ukrainian administration are ahead of a lot of developed countries in digitalization and so forth. So they have, the change is still ongoing now, but this will be part of the agenda. One important element also in the reconstruction will be coordination, to have a good coordination. And now I think the G7 has put in place a coordination structure with Ukrainian. We with other IFIs have also developed and with the Ukrainian government, they've put in place operational coordination structure in order to be sure that we are all moving in the same direction, using, the best qualities of each of us in order to be the most effective possible on the ground.
Thank you so much. Moving to Germany, Mr. Kukis, you're State Secretary, Federal Chancellor of Germany. If I understand it correctly, you are advising on the economy to the Chancellor in that function, but also on EU affairs.
Yes.
Yes, okay. Of course, you had G7 presidency. Overall, if you can also just, from Germany's perspective, how do you see Germany and Europe is responding to the immediate needs of the Ukrainian people? And then I would also like to get your perspective on, of course, reconstruction now, but what are the elements that would make it, number one, relevant for Ukraine, but also then making it building blocks of a modern economy in the future. So again, for the 21st century.
Yep. Okay, so that question could fill a whole evening, so I'll try to answer it briefly. I think the two things that were vital in terms of the work that we did at the G7 level and the European level was, on the one side, the sanctions regime imposed by the G7 in record time. I still remember the time between the shock of the night of the 24th of February, but then immediately starting to think about what can we do to freeze the 300 billion of central bank assets, because we had seen some indications in the week before that money was being withdrawn, and we said we have to, before the weekend ends, we have to cut that channel of repatriation of funds. That's the biggest damage we can do in the shortest amount of time on the Russian war machine. So the fact that we were able not only to decide within the G7 on the policy, but also in the European Union of the 27 on legislative acts that we passed like literally 10 minutes before midnight from Sunday to Monday to make this effective, that was probably the first big rallying call to show we are very, very united. And then, of course, the elements of the sanction regime, number 1, 2, 3, that are less discussed, I think, are now seeing the damage they are extracting on the Russian war machine. The ban on all kinds of semiconductor exports, the ban on all exports of dual-use goods, I think is really hurting Russia's ability to restock, and is really causing damage in Russia. There was a lot of skepticism at the beginning on how effective this was, but the sanctions regime we always said it's not going to work immediately, but we're seeing now that the toll being extracted is very severe. Also on energy, the fact that we were able to rid ourselves of first of Russian coal, then of Russian oil, now of Russian gas. I think, yes, Gazprom will make a lot of money looking back in 22, but the sources of revenue in 23 are getting less and less. The fact that we've now have a hard cap on Russian oil, the fact that we are not importing any molecules in Germany, very few molecules in the rest of Europe, that will very strongly impact adversely the ability of Russia to finance this war operation. So in that sense, I think in terms of how did we respond, I think it was quite forceful. One of the biggest moments I had in the last year was in May, when I accompanied Chancellor Olaf Scholz and Presidents Macron and Draghi and Johannes, together with President Zelensky, announced the candidacy status of Ukraine, well, the support of the four countries for the candidacy status. And as you know, there was a lot of controversy at the time about this question within the European Union, and the fact that in Kiev they announced it basically solved the questions. 3 days later, the European Union made the decision unanimously. So in that sense, that was also, I think, a very important impetus, because it goes exactly in the direction of what Odile was saying, what is important for private sector investment. The fact that the European Union has now said we will give candidacy status assures every investor that in the next 5 years, whatever amount it takes, of time it takes, all of the rule of law questions, all the questions of concern to private sector investors are being incentivized in a massive way by the sort of alignment that there will be on coming to the acquis of the European Union. So I think that is both important for Ukraine per se as striving to the European Union, but also for investors and incentivizing this investment, because it gives you a very clear path into all of the legal requirements, but also a lot of the funding that will become available as the proximity between Ukraine and the European Union gets closer and closer.
Thank you so much. I'd like to go back to the Deputy Prime Minister, because a number of you mentioned the private sector. So what are your plans in terms of reforms of the private sector as part of the broader reconstruction effort? Could you tell us a little more about what you're planning there?
For private sector, yes. So for private sector, I mentioned before, we are working out insurance mechanism that will allow them to invest in Ukraine during the wartime. So it's actually it's a new mechanism. Previously, something common. It was previously during the war, like 30 years or 40 years ago. So now we asked Export Credit Agency and MIGA and DFC just to review their portfolio of the products and proposed the products that will satisfy this company willing to invest in Ukraine right now during the wartime. Absolutely agree with the deals. We need to invest now, not to wait until the war will be finished. So for other things that we keep providing corporate governance reform, and now we have in this supervisory board of Naftogaz. We think that we will set up a new supervisory board of Naftogaz that will be the interviewing will be finished, and the whole procedure will be finished by the end of this week. And the next week there is going to be new supervisory board. It's important because Naftogaz is a vital company for energy system. So it's and we will keep going to provide and launch corporate governance. So also another plans is deregulation for Ukrainian business and foreign business. And there was some ideas and discussion about the tax reform, but I think that for now, what we need is just to keep the macroeconomic stability right now, because if you look at our expenditure, 50% of our expenditure is caused by our partners, and 50% of our expenditure is covered by Ukrainian business, by the revenue and taxes that we collect inside of country. So that's why we need to keep Ukrainian company operating, and that's why we will, together with our IFIs, provide these different programs. First of all, it's access to finance, and it's an insurance. This is the main thing that should be on the table right now during the wartime, to persuade Ukrainian business continue working, and to persuade foreign companies come to Ukraine during the wartime and start business. As you know, our president said that Ukraine, exactly on the second day of the victory, will become the Mecca for investments. So that's why we you know, and he always stressed that for this company willing to come and to work exactly on the next day, they should start it right now to make the preliminary studies, to make some additional analysis, not to waste time, and to gain the biggest opportunity on the next day after the victory.
Madam Deputy Prime Minister, one more thing. We haven't talked too much about the social aspect or the societal aspect of the needs that the Ukrainians have. Of course, it's tragic for children. There is always the risk of really losing the traction you need to have with children on education, healthcare, etc. So could you just give us a sense of the needs and also what kind of considerations you have around that societal tissue of Ukraine also for the reconstruction? Maybe it's already part of some of those discussions that you're having with partners.
So for social needs, I would say, so I think that the big challenge for us is going to be unemployment rate. Unemployment rate related to the fact that 7 million Ukrainians are living abroad right now, and it's majority of them, 90%, it's our labor that will very actively engaged in the Ukrainian economy, so we need to return them back. And unemployment rate inside of country. So if you look at the numbers, so National Bank of Ukraine estimates 30% of unemployment rate, but it means that 4.6 million Ukrainians are searching for a job and not able to find it. But these numbers consist of 2.6 million out of country and that are willing to come right now and to work, and 2 million inside of country. So that's why what we're trying to do right now, we understand that we rely a lot on our partners, and we should show that we're also trying to limit our costs, and we're decrease the expenditure for the unemployment fees. What we're trying to stimulate people to work, and we are it called Army of Recovery. So for those Ukrainians willing to work and participate in the recovery on this early stage, or to help regional state administration to participate in the preparation of the heating season, they can join this Army of Recovery. It's also a governmental program that the main idea is just to provide them with a proper job places for Ukrainians willing to work. So the main idea right now, it's for those one that are unable to find a job, to provide it with the Army of Recovery. For those who have entrepreneurship skills, to provide some guarantees, financial and granting from the government to set up or enlarge their business. And it's an extremely popular program right now in Ukraine. We have just for several months, 16,000 applications from Ukrainians that previously had working experience in business, just willing right now to set up or enlarge their activity during the wartime. So we are like a government, just need to provide people with opportunity to work and to develop their skills during the wartime, because residential restoring of the residential building, and we're very grateful for the partners that provide us with different construction and workplace, that factors that influence Ukrainians to return back or to stay in Ukraine and to fight by the end.
Thank you. If you just got a quick reaction, because we're coming to an end, but just from Alexei, the Deputy Prime Minister mentioned, of course, unemployment. So obviously there is war, people are fleeing. There's a lot of disruption. I have talked to some executives in Ukraine, and I know how much big companies are also part of the picture. So I'm just interested, for example, your employees. How are you dealing with the fact that maybe some of them are displaced? How do you take care of them?
First of all, I'm very proud of our employees. I think the role of Ukrainian right now is the direct service to your country. You can do it either on the battlefield or in the service. You should serve to your people. That is why we have some part of our employees on the front line and the rest in the office. Of course, we have some part that have left the country. We all understand it. There are different circumstances. Many of them have come back already, and I'm really proud of it. I know many of our personnel is actively working under the shelling and constant risk to their life, and they're doing it absolutely voluntarily, with open heart and mind. And I'm sure that the strategy of breaking the spirit of Ukrainians will never work, and Ukrainians will go ahead. That is a very important and historical moment for us. The next enemy Ukraine should fight is internal enemy, which is definitely lies in the area of anti-corruption, corporate governance, reforms agenda, judicial reform, all the factors that are desperately needed to this country regardless of the war. Let us remember, did Ukraine suffer from equity shortage before the war? Yes. We still were looking for international investment, for IFIs to come and others. And it didn't work in the way we wanted. We should perform reforms agenda as soon as possible, and we cannot wait until the war is over. We should do it right now. Because once the war is over, no one is willing to invest in the country which is not reformed. And we're doing it right now. I used to be the member of Ukrainian government for the last 3 years, and I can tell you that Ukrainian government worked 24/7 during the war. No governor, no mayor of Ukraine left the country, left the job. It's very important. And we can perform during the war. We can do reforms during the war. And maybe it is the best moment to do, because during the war, the situation is black and white. You should win, and you should survive. That means you should do reforms. Right now, you do it immediately. So once you prevail, the country is more capable and more interface-oriented for the international investment.
Thank you so much. We have 2 minutes left, so quick reactions. Going back to you, Minister Skinari. So I happen to come from a country that then became part of the EU, and I still remember the tremendous momentum that the accession process created, unprecedented momentum in the history of my country. So I just wonder how you look from Helsinki now. Ukraine is an EU candidate country to the future of the relationship between the EU and Ukraine. What would be your hopes, or how do you view it from Helsinki overall on that relationship?
Finland, Sweden, Austria becoming members 1995. I still remember that well. A lot of ambitiousness, a lot of implementation. But as said here earlier, rule of law, reforms, of course, there is a roadmap. There is a roadmap, and everything is doable. And for instance, Finland has supported Ukraine with the expertise and know-how of rule of law. So all these elements are doable. And of course, we really hope that we can see these reforms in action. But the most important thing is the spirit, commitment of the country, its people and the decision makers. So of course, European Ukraine is a goal that we all would like to see.
Thank you. Maybe the same question to you, Mr. Kukis.
Well, I mean, I think Ukraine has huge potential. I mean, the amount of skill and talent and natural resources available in Ukraine should make every investor interested in the country. I mean, we're seeing that in the temporarily displaced people. There's no country of origin of people coming to Germany who are as keen to learn the language, to work with skills as developed, even though they know they only want to stay in Germany, the vast majority, for a few months, a year or two. They still, if you talk to German industry federations, they're very keen to employing citizens from the Ukraine as soon as it's possible. And usually it works very well. And all of the companies from Germany investing in the Ukraine already are saying, as soon as the rule of law issues are resolved, the quality of the skills in the Ukrainian population is enormous. The labor participation rates is enormous. The amount of space and natural resources and energy in terms of renewable power of the Ukraine is immense. So in that sense, I can only agree. And of course, the integration into the EU will bring a lot of structural funds and support mechanisms that will speed that up as the process towards EU extension happens. So in that sense, I think all stars are aligned in that sense. And then don't forget, we have now, as of December last year, the international multi-agency donors platform set up. So we now have a forum for all of the international and global support mechanisms. And we were very conscious when we set this up at the Berlin conference together with the European Union and the G7 to crowd in private investors. So all of you from the private sector, please look at this platform very carefully, because we want to crowd in private capital alongside all of the government money to set up incentives for the reform process, and of course also the investment process.
Thank you. And just finishing our discussion today with Madame Renaud-Bassot, EBRD has played such a major role in transforming, again, Eastern Europe and other economies. I've followed your work very closely. And when economies then graduate from your programs, it's also a signal or a sign of they're in a good place, they're ready. And so if you look to the future, as if you were to look to the graduation there, what makes you, just very briefly, what makes you hopeful when you look at the landscape Ukraine? And outside military risks, of course, also, what would be the things that you would maybe point to in terms of risks as advice, so that then really you see yet another big successful program being wrapped up in Ukraine in the future? Over to you.
Now, first, I fully share the idea that the fact that the war has really sort of transformed in a way the government and the efficiency of the institution. So in the current, under huge pressure and the need really to deliver, things are functioning much better than they used to be. And I mean, and some issues have really been addressed. So I think that's a very positive place to be. And I agree that the European perspective and European accession process will be a key driver in terms of further reform, rule of law, governance, and so forth. And this will really be the basis for deep transformation of the country. I think that the reconstruction will be a huge opportunity for investors, because I mean, and there has been some. I attended some meeting with foreign investors in different countries where you see the appetite to. I mean, reconstruction means a lot of activity and so forth. So but what is important also is investment in the country, and not only to rebuild but also to develop activity there. And there is a huge potential. We will need to think about specific instruments, and I think everything you mentioned about, insurance and so forth, because probably still in the reconstruction phase, there may be some remaining uncertainties or risk that needs to be covered. But I'm pretty sure that this could really be a big driver in growth, rebound, and more prosperity for Ukraine.
Thank you. With that advice, we are concluding our session today. In a way, what we've just did here, we were talking about the immediate needs, but also at the same time investing in the future. That's frankly the philosophy of the annual meeting this year, the dual vision of navigating 2023, but also simultaneously investing for the long term. So thank you so much, and particular thanks to the Deputy Prime Minister and the CEO of Naftogaz for joining us here. I know it was not an easy journey You left a country at war, so thank you so much for coming. All the best.
The most of the days we have certain shortages with electricity. We are fixing our energy system, but we all should understand the repairing of energy system is more a duct tape repairing type. Yeah. So we should really restructure and reconstruct it after the war once it is possible.
Peace formula.
Yes.
The First Lady spent quite a long time on it.
In terms of energy, of course, our task is to achieve energy independence level. Within the gas production, we plan to increase gas production already this year significantly, as well as constructing of decentralized energy supply. All these fields would require significant equity investors, but we should consider this in this moment, of course, under the umbrella of appropriate guarantees from the international society that would guarantee this kind of private equity investment.
So first, what is your assessment militarily, if you can share, in terms of what you saw, but also then again those immediate needs
of the Marshall Plan or of the reconstruction plan to bring in continued transformation of the country, improve the efficiency of, public administration, even if they have in the context of the war, there has been a huge effort. You know, for example, we have, I think the Ukrainian administration are ahead of a lot of developed countries in digitalization and so forth. So there has change is still ongoing now, but this will be part of the agenda. One important element of also in the reconstruction will be coordination, to have a good coordination. And now I think the G7 has put in place a coordination structure with Ukrainian. We with other IFIs have also developed sort of, and with the Ukrainian government, they've put in place operational coordination structure in order to be sure that we are all moving in the same direction, using, the best qualities of each of us in order to be the most effective possible on the ground.
As part of
human rights and on some areas of regional security. But despite that, it is possible, and I would say it is essential, for the two countries to have meaningful engagement on climate, trade, and technology to avoid the decoupling of economies, of even the possibility of future confrontations. For the historians that might be listening, we must avoid a 21st century sequel of the so-called Thucydides trap. At the same time, and secondly, the North-South divide is deepening. I am not convinced, in my contacts, that the wealthier world and their leaders truly grasps the degree of frustration and even anger in the global south. Frustration and anger about the gross inequity of vaccine distribution in the recent past. frustration and anger about the pandemic recovery, with support overwhelmingly concentrated in wealthier countries that could print money. And trillions were printed in the global north, and of course, developing countries could not print money because their currencies would go out the drain. Frustration and anger about a climate crisis that is crippling countries that contributed least to global heating, and the lack of the financial resources to respond to the challenge. And frustration and anger over a morally bankrupt financial system in which systemic inequalities are amplifying societal inequalities. A system that is still routinely denying debt relief and concessional funding to vulnerable middle-income countries that are in desperate need, because the rules are not made to allow it. A system in which most of the world's poorest countries saw their debt service payments skyrocketed by 35% in the last year alone. Now, we need to bridge all these divides, and we need to restore trust. How can we do it? First, by reforming and building fairness into the global financial system. Developing countries need access to finance to reduce poverty and hunger and advance the Sustainable Development Goals. I have urged the G20 to agree on a global SDG stimulus plan that would provide support to countries of the global south, including the vulnerable middle-income ones. They need the necessary liquidity, debt relief and restructuring, as well as long-term lending to invest in sustainable development. In short, we need a new debt architecture. And multilateral development banks must change their business model. Beyond their own operations, that of course are very important, they must concentrating on multiplying their impact, leveraging massively private finance in a systematic way, providing guarantees, accepting to be first risk takers in coalitions of financial institutions to support developing countries. Without creating the conditions for massive inflow of private finance at reasonable cost to the developing world, there is simply no solution. International financial institutions are too small, and the capacity to increase ODA is not to be seen in the short term. Then second, bridging divides and restoring trust means meaningful climate action, and climate action now. The battle to keep the 1.5-degree limit alive will be won or lost in these decades, on our watch. And right now, we have to confess that the battle is being lost. So we need to act together to close the emissions gap. And that means to phase out progressively coal and supercharge the renewable revolution, to end the addiction to fossil fuels, and to stop our self-defeating war on nature. On the other hand, the developed world must finally deliver on its 100 billion climate finance commitment to support developing countries. Adaptation finance must be doubled, as it was promised in Sharm el-Sheikh. And the biggest emitters, namely the G20 countries, must unite around the Climate Solidarity Pact, in which they make extra efforts in the 2020s to keep the 1.5-degree limit alive. And it doesn't work if developed countries attribute responsibility to emerging economies and the emerging economies attribute responsibility to developed countries. They need to come together, to bring together all their capacities, financial and technological, with the developed ones providing financial and technical assistance to help the major emerging economies to accelerate their renewable energy transition. Because if they don't, we will not be able to reduce emissions at the level that is necessary to keep the 1.5-degree goal, I would say to keep the 2-degree goal alive. And our climate goals need the full engagement of the private sector. Now, the truth is that more and more businesses are making net zero commitments, but benchmarks and criteria are often dubious or murky. And this can mislead consumers, investors, and regulators with false narratives. And it feeds a culture of climate misinformation and confusion, and leaves the door open to greenwashing. That's why we created an expert group on net zero emissions commitments recently the group has issued a how-to guide for credible, accountable net zero pledges. And here at Davos, I call on all corporate leaders to act based on these guidelines, to put forward credible and transparent transition plans on how to achieve net zero and to submit those plans before the end of the year. Now, the transition to net zero must be grounded in real emissions cuts and not relying essentially on carbon credits or shadow markets. And finally, what is true about private sector engagement on climate applies across a range of challenges. And government action is critical, even if obviously it is not enough. We must find avenues to boost the private sector's ability to play its full role for good. And it must be recognized that in many ways, the private sector today is leading, but it is to a certain extent undermined by government action or the lack of government action. Governments need to create the adequate regulatory and stimulus environments to support the private sector instead of maintaining rules, subsidies, and other forms of action that undermine the efforts of the private sector to move forward in climate action. And business models and practices must be reworked to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. Without creating the conditions for the massive engagement of the private sector, it will be impossible to move from the billions to trillions that is needed to achieve the SDGs. To lead the way, to expand economic opportunity for women, to ensure greater engagement and cooperation for vaccine equity, to achieve global food security, and for that, we need the cooperation of the private sector to keep Ukrainian and Russian food and fertilizer exports flowing and affordable. Even in the midst of the war, the insurance sector has helped support the movement of vessels from Ukraine and Russia. And we urgently need other private sector actors to engage, such as the banking sector, the traders, and the shippers. Across the spectrum of global challenges, we need private sector resourcefulness and cooperation to be able to advance in our common objectives of peace, of sustainable development, and of human rights. So, Excellencies and dear friends, there are no perfect solutions in a perfect storm, but we can work to control the damage and to seize the opportunities available. And now more than ever, it's time to forge the best ways to cooperation in our fragmented world, to adopt multilateral solutions, to bring trust to where trust is badly needed because the world cannot wait. And I thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. I think you also heard a warm applause that your call to action was well received. And I think we also have seen in the last years that businesses are taking on more responsibilities, both on climate and nature. But as you said, we are flirting with a climate disaster, a battle that we are almost losing. But what I think we all don't really understand is that we all know that the cost of inaction far exceeds the cost of action. And why is not the financing happening? Why is not the money to adaptation coming there? Is there, how do you explain this? Because if there was common sense, we would do it. Maybe it's not that common.
Well, there is a difference. The cost of action is today's cost. The cost of inaction is already today's cost, but it is essentially tomorrow's cost. And we have a dramatic bias in the political life, but also in many areas of the business life, which is the preference for the present. No, I was in politics for a large part of my life. And I know how important it is for politicians to look at the polls, to see how things are going, to look at the next elections. And today in the world, most of the political choices that are made are still made with a short-term perspective and looking more at polls, future elections, political power struggles, and less on effectively solving problems. Let's be frank. And in the business community, there was a clear trend, which is now being mitigated, to look essentially into short-term objectives, to increase the value of shareholders. And to increase the value of shareholders is to bet on short-term measures to get short-term results and forget about the future, because the future we will see afterwards. So we badly need to change the mentality of decision makers in the public sector and in the private sector. And I would say it will be easier to do it in the private sector than in the public sector. But politicians need to understand, and sometimes we are faced with this kind of challenges. It is better to take today decisions that will eventually be not popular, but it will be essential to be able to shape the public opinion itself. My experience when I was in government is that when I was following the polls, I would have problems in the short term. And then when I was able to show leadership and go even to what was the prevailing trend of the opinion and take the decisions that were necessary to ensure the future of my country at the time, that in the end would pay. So my appeal to decision makers in the public and the private sector is, don't look about what's going to happen to you tomorrow, look into what's going to happen to all of us in the future. And to be honest, it is also already happening now.
Well, thank you. And I think what we would hope for is that people that aspire to be leaders, both in business and in governments, also think about what kind of legacy they want to leave.
And we need to create systems of stimulus that benefit long-term thinking, instead of the present systems that theoretically are conceived to benefit short-term results.
And I guess
this is very important.
Social media is maybe not helping when it comes to incentivizing long-term thinking.
No, I mean, we have in social media all kinds of things. We have fantastic contributions to social media for the most noble causes of humankind. And we have also the problems, in my opinion, of the business model of social media, in which, of course, the interest is to have as much interactions as possible and to reach as much people as possible. And as we know from traditional media, that what is news is not when a dog bites a man. What is news is when a man bites a dog. The algorithms and the business model of social media are constructed in such a way that they tend to expand the, I would say, the informations, the positions, the ideas that are more extreme, that are more controversial, that create more trouble. And so I think it's not a question of censorship that will solve the problem. The question is the business model needs to be redesigned. The algorithms need to be redesigned in order not to be based on evil to make profit.
No, it's such a good point. You know, when we grew up and read the papers, the editor took the pride in everything being correct in the paper. And now there's no editing. It's up to the individual to then assess if this is true or not.
Yes, but there is a responsibility of the platforms. I mean, one can argue if we have something, as you mentioned, in the media, and if someone is attacked in a way that is wrong, there is a possibility to go to the court. In social media, there is no responsibility. And I can understand the argument of social media platforms saying, well, this is put by people, so it's not our responsibility. But the truth is that the algorithms are made in such a way that they amplify in a preferential way a certain number of things. And when the algorithm amplifies, then there is, in my opinion, a responsibility, and there should be accountability including through the legal system in relation to those situations. At least when false information, defamation, all other kinds of things are benefited, are not only just what someone puts, but are benefited by the way the algorithm amplifies that. That creates, in my opinion, a responsibility of the platform.
No, thank you very much for that. Reflecting on the state of the world and listening to your very powerful speech, I was reflecting, have you ever in your career seen such a complex geopolitical and geoeconomic landscape?
Let's be clear. I think we are in the worst situation I remember in my lifetime. I mean, I have not lived the Second World War. If I had lived the Second World War, what I'm saying now would not make sense. But I really think we are in the worst situation of my lifetime. First of all, the climate threat is coming to a point of no return. We are using 1.6 planets, and we have only one planet to use. And the climate and the biodiversity issues have lost attraction for political decision makers. Everybody is concentrated now on the war in Ukraine, on the cost of living and other aspects. And there is a lack of the sense of urgency in relation to climate. And the question of climate, together with the question of biodiversity, is an existential threat that today is very close to a tipping point that makes catastrophes totally irreversible. And that would not be the case 10 or 20 years ago. We still had much more time to act, and we have not used that time to act sufficiently. So now we are on the verge of the irreversible changes that will completely undermine the future of the life in the planet as we today see it. Second, the geopolitical divide is different from what it was during the Cold War. The Cold War was easier because we had two blocks, and those two blocks had clear rules of engagement. No, they would create as much trouble as possible to the other bloc, but they had mechanisms to guarantee that if the trouble would become a threat to the two blocs themselves, they would stop whatever was happening by proxy anywhere in the world. Those mechanisms that were particularly relevant in relation to the nuclear disarmament and to the nuclear control mechanisms, those mechanisms have lost existence or lost capacity. People got used to the 90s, to the beginning of the 20th century, to the idea of the end of history, and there is no more a risk of a global confrontation. And so the confrontations today are more dangerous because there are less mechanisms to make sure that they do not get out of control. And this is what, for me, is worrying. On the other hand, in the two blocks, we had a total decoupling. But the total decoupling that existed with the two blocks was in a completely different global economic situation. This was before the great globalization surge. The great globalization surge was in the 90s. I mean, and now we leave the global globalization surge. Our economies became completely interlinked, north and south, east and west. And now there is a new divide that is coming with the risk of decoupling that I mentioned. And I think it is absolutely crucial that independently of the difference that exists, we are facing two cultural systems, two ideological systems, two historic memories, two political systems in many aspects, but we can't afford not to have the United States and its allies and China having a serious discussion on the questions relating to climate, to trade and to technology, and to find the forms of cooperation or regulation that are necessary to avoid a decoupling that would be a disaster of the global economy and to avoid the risks of future confrontations. Because today we start to quarrel about the economic things, being it semiconductors, access or other of this nature, and tomorrow you might be quarreling about more serious issues because there are some irritating factors that are there on the ground, some geopolitical problems that are not solved in the region. We have the Taiwan question, we have others. So it is absolutely essential, first of all, to be careful in controlling the risky situations, and at the same time, to establish mechanisms that rescue our global economy.
Talking about decoupling, and you also mentioned it in your speech, Secretary General, if there is a full decoupling, it will shave off a lot of growth, and we will lose out on prosperity, there will be more poverty. But don't you foresee, if there is decoupling, that could be just for like 10% of the goods? It could be related to national security, semiconductors, some technologies. And if you then can continue to trade on 90% of the goods, we're much better off. I think what you're addressing is that a full decoupling will be a catastrophe.
That's what we are seeing. What you said is what we are seeing now. I mean, as far as I understand, the trade between China and the US is growing. And the decoupling that is being tried is essential in relation to technology. And we know the semiconductor situation. China still has a huge dependency on semiconductors, especially the semiconductors of the, I would say, more sophisticated dimension. They essentially are produced by Taiwan at the present moment, most of them. So there has been some attempts to limit the access of China to these kind of semiconductors, and also to the machines that produce them. And the biggest producer is the Netherlands. And the Netherlands are reacting because they would like to keep their market, which is perfectly understandable. So for the moment, this is limited to certain areas of technology. The problem is that these areas of technology will shape the future economy. And so the risk is that if there is not a serious negotiation in relation to trade and technology, and I believe that serious negotiation is still possible, if there is no serious negotiation in relation to these areas, we might have consequences in the future when the areas that are now relatively minor in the global economy will probably become the central aspects of the future global economy that will be much more technological based than the present one.
And I think, unfortunately, you're right on this, because the rivalry between G2 is also based on controlling those technologies.
The idea that we can live with a G2 is an idea that should be put aside. The G2 would mean a G0. It would mean that we would not have the capacity to bring together the resources, the energy, the capacities, the technologies that we need to face the challenges that we're facing. Because climate will not respect the G2, demography will not respect the G2, and the dramatic situation of developing countries will not respect the G2.
Secretary General, last question. I wish we could have continued. It's so much insight. I think, as you mentioned, also the impact of the war in Ukraine has on food prices, energy is substantial. Do you think there will be an end of this war this year? Do you think there will be an end of this war this year?
No, there will be an end of this war. There is an end of everything. But I do not see an end of the war in the immediate future, unfortunately. I mean, I do not see a chance at the present moment to have a serious peace negotiation between the two parties. And let's be clear, the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, that was in violation of international law and the values of the Charter, has created a situation in which, because to a large extent, the two sides have a basic disagreement on the past. And it's always very difficult to solve disagreements on the past. Two different ideas about what the Russian Empire was, what the nationalities were, and two different ideas about what today are Ukrainians and are Russians. It is clear that, in my opinion, this makes it more difficult to find a solution. But that solution needs to be based on international law and needs to respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And I don't see conditions for that to happen in the immediate future. what we are doing, and we are very strongly engaged, is in relation to the Black Sea Grain Initiative, which I must say, it's quite amazing that with two countries in war, it's possible to have an agreement in this regard, but also the Russian exports that are necessary for the global food security. We have been dealing with the problems of rescuing civilians in difficult situations like Azovstal in the past. We have been discussing with both sides exchange of prisoners of war. We are supporting the International Agency of Atomic Energy, that is a UN body, in relation to Zaporizhia now in relation. So, I mean, we are doing everything we can, and this is probably one of the most important areas of our activity, to limit the damage, to reduce the suffering of the people, and to reduce the impacts, the dramatic, devastating impact in the global economy, because it came on top of the COVID, on top of the inequalities, on top of the climate problems. So we are trying to address the consequences, but for the moment, I don't think that we have a chance to promote or to mediate a serious negotiation to achieve peace in the short term. So we'll have still to wait and to be clear on our principles, and our principles are international law, the values of the Charter, territorial integrity, but at the same time to try to do everything we can, talking to both sides and to other actors, in order to minimize the impacts on the suffering of the Ukrainian people and on the global economy, especially in the most vulnerable countries.
Thank you so much, Secretary General. I'm sorry we had to end on such a somber note, but I think it's reflecting the world we are living. I think many of us do hope for the Secretary General's good offices and the United Nations and multilateralism in such a situation. So thank you very much for your leadership, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. All the best.
and need to be fundamentally rethought. Both rely on climate change models that, for example, in 2018 forecast that global warming is likely to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius between 2030 and 2052 if it continues to increase at the current rate. It is these climate models that spur our politicians to rapidly pursue net zero goals. But NOAA data for the past 7 years confirms that these models are wrong, and this IPCC prediction is certainly wrong. And more, the very latest data shows the cooling trend of the last 7 years is actually growing. The planet is cooling faster than before. At the end of the 7-year period, January 2015 to December 2021, global average temperature was in decline by 0.09 degrees Celsius per decade. At the end of January 2022, the rate of decrease was maintained at 0.09 degrees Celsius per decade. The NOAA data for February 2022 shows the rate of decrease in global average temperature has now increased to 0.1 degrees Celsius per decade. The decrease is getting stronger. Some politicians have realized that our political leaders in the West are rushing a net zero strategy despite the conflicting evidence of decreasing global temperature and the increasing costs of living being imposed on the general public. Net zero must be questioned even more after the tragedy of the war in Ukraine. And we emphasize it is the West that is threatened by net zero. Putin and Xi did not attend COP26. The Prime Minister of India announced that India will target net zero carbon emissions by 2070. That's 2 decades later than the targets for the COP26 conference. And he was right to do so, for this IPCC prediction and the report containing it are shown to be incorrect by 7 years and 2 months of NOAA data. The politicians of the West are urged to rethink their net zero strategies. Otherwise, the West faces chaos while China, India, and Russia will grow their economies and even use their natural resources to gain political and military.
It has been able to deliver a relatively stable oil price, one that is predictable by both consumers and producers. Some other energy sources have faced significant challenges in that regard, significant rises, and we continue to be committed to that.
He also stated that as the world's top oil exporter, Saudi Arabia has a responsibility to provide stability to the oil market while transitioning to a clean energy future so that it does not hamper the progress of the developing world. Well, for more on this, we're joined by Chris Beauchamp, Chief Market Analyst at IG, joining us live from London. Chris, many thanks for your time this morning and some stark words from the IMF there. Just give us your assessment on that.
Yeah, I think it reflects a lot of caution about the global economy, the fragmentation that you're seeing with the breakdown in not relations, but sort of trade links to a number of major economies. And it's part of a theme, I think, that's been rolling around markets for at least a year now, that we should be due some kind of recession, or we should be due a major economic hit. And I think this is partially consequent of inflation. It's the hangover of the pandemic. It's the response to inflation by central banks, really. And all this combined together, I think, shows that the IMF is concerned that there is going to be a major tough period, if you like, for the global economy that will, in some ways, undo a lot of the economic growth we've seen over the past decade.
And Chris, we obviously heard from Saudi Arabia there, stating that in their view, stability is key when it comes to oil supply. But then, of course, we have these ambitions as a world to turn to a greener future. What did you make of those comments from Saudi Arabia?
Well, that's very interesting, because if you look at what Aramco is doing itself, it is actually expected to be the last big oil major, if you like, pure oil company standing. So Saudi Arabia appears, if anything, to be determined to stay where it is, if you like, in terms of its position on oil, and make sure that it is the go-to destination for oil supplies, which, regardless of the shift to important shift, of course, to renewable energy, etc., it will remain an integral part of the global economy. You've seen this to an extent almost going to reverse with the energy crisis this year. I think the sense, partly with the lack of nuclear in Europe, but elsewhere, that countries still have to rely on oil and maintain those supplies and maintain stability. And the concerns about that have increased with those choke points that oil has to travel around. And of course, if US-China tensions ramp up, that could be something that sort of throw the spanner into the works of oil supplies too. Is something that needs to be carefully monitored, I think, really.
Chris Beauchamp, Chief Markets Analyst at IG, many thanks there for your insight.
Now, the Managing Director of International Monetary Fund, Kristalina Georgieva, has said that global growth will bottom out this year. While speaking at World Economic Forum in Davos, she affirmed the IMF's forecast for global growth rate to slow to 2.7% this year, from around 3.2% last year.
Projections, we expect growth to further decelerate this year. But since in the beginning of the year, we do seek some good news, here it is for you. We also expect in 23 growth to bottom out. In other words, to start a process in which we go up rather than down.
The IMF chief highlighted three significant challenges confronting the world: the war in Ukraine, high interest rates, and the cost of living crisis. She warned the world that if global tensions are allowed to fragment the world economy, it could cost trillions in lost growth. At the same event, Saudi Arabia's foreign minister expressed that their position was correct amidst last year's row with the United States over OPEC Plus decision to reduce oil output targets.
Overall, was committed to a clean energy future. Energy security is absolutely key, and here what we feel in the kingdom is that stability is absolutely the key to that energy security. So one of what we believe the successes of, for instance, OPEC and OPEC Plus has been able to deliver a relatively stable oil price, one that is predictable by both consumers and producers. Some other energy sources have faced significant challenges in that regard, significant rises, and we continue to be committed to that.
Now, he also stated that as the world's top oil exporter, Saudi Arabia has a responsibility to provide stability to the oil market while transitioning to a clean energy future so that it does not hamper the progress of the developing world.
The Indian IT giants are also hopeful about a faster recovery from the economic slowdown that the world faces currently. Companies have seen only a minor reduction in order book, and layoffs are being seen as a result of the rationalization of large-scale hiring that happened in the last 2 years. World's business editor Sumit Chaturvedi caught up with Tech Mahindra CEO C.P. Gurnani on the outlook of the global and the Indian economy and the latest happenings in the IT space. Take a look.
We're here at World Economic Forum in Davos. Many Indian companies are also here. One such big company is Tech Mahindra, and its CEO, C.P. Gurnani, is joining us today. So thanks for talking to us. First of all, we are here at Davos. What is the kind of sense you're getting? The client, the recession fears, inflation, interest rates. What is the kind of sense we are getting here?
Shumit, in a lot of ways, what we see not only in Davos but around the world is a story of contradictions. Last 20 days I've been traveling, and different parts of the world, I would say Southeast Asia, India, Middle East, Saudi Arabia particularly, the mood is very upbeat. In Europe, there are two schools of thought. One definitely is a sigh of relief because they were bracing themselves for a much harder recession. UK clearly